Okay, so welcome everybody. Just before we start with this insightful webinar, I would like to go through some housekeeping rules. As you would have heard, this presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded onto our CISA DRM YouTube channel for larger dissemination amongst our colleagues. Should you be worried about your privacy in any way, please message us in the chat box, but please do not stop the recording since this is a learning opportunity that we would like to make available to students and colleagues unable to join us today, especially since load shedding is back. Can all comments and questions please be placed in the chat box? We will be addressing all questions at the end, unless Prof Barnes provides time between his sections for any questions, but he has also indicated that he's going to take about 40 minutes and we'll have the rest of the time for questions. Please switch off your camera and microphone to minimize any distractions during the presentation. I would also really like to thank Fatima Peters for your technical support this afternoon and all the marketing you have done for this webinar, as well as our other executives. So I see Angelina Mapula and Shafika Dokrat also on the call. Thanks, ladies, for providing us support as well. But right, why all of us are here today is to listen to this wonderfully insightful webinar by Professor Brendon Barnes. For those unfamiliar, Professor Brendon Barnes is a professor of psychology and the Vice Dean of Research, Postgraduate Studies and Innovation in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Johannesburg. He writes in the fields of critical psychology, environmental health and justice, and contributes to the field in 4 ways: to identify evidence of disproportionate environmental impacts, to deepen understandings of behavior in environmental studies, to strengthen critical methodologies to study environmental and social injustices, and to reveal the ways in which environmental activism is undermined. Today's webinar focuses on analyzing qualitative transcripts thematically. Prof will be using a real-world example to develop different levels of themes and how they align to the aims and objectives of the study. He'll also be providing us with suggestions on how to prepare the data for analysis and how to write up and present our qualitative findings. Thank you so much for your time, Prof Barnes. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that really warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to interact via this webinar, and I hope I can provide some insight into thematic analysis. I also hope you will have loads of questions for me afterwards. So here goes. So today I'm going to focus on thematic analysis. Let me say that I am not going to give you a step-by-step guide to thematic analysis that exists. There's a lot written about thematic analysis. But what I am going to do is focus on giving you a broad introduction to thematic analysis. I want to pay a lot of attention to transcriptions and the importance of transcriptions. We'll also then talk to you about analysis and some particularly tricky parts of analysis. For example, the difference between a code and a theme that often gets us confused. And then I also want to make a few points about writing up thematic analyses in a way that actually makes a meaningful contribution and shows that you've done a good analysis. The most important thing and most frustrating thing, I think, for most researchers, including seasoned researchers, is this idea of going around in circles. But it's particularly evident among young researchers. I'm going to use this example continuously throughout the presentation to demonstrate 3 points throughout. And the first point is that your analysis actually starts before the formal analysis. So while we are talking today about thematic analysis, I want to make a point that actually the analysis happens way, way, way before the actual analysis. It happens in the conceptualization, it happens in the development of the research questions, it happens with the theoretical development, and that the analysis actually slots in to that. But unless you have those previous earlier phases in place, you are going to go around in circles. The second point I want to make today is that analysis is not a recipe. And too often we see this in the academy, where students end up going in circles, chasing their own tails, mainly because they see analysis as something miraculous that happens, and that you could open a book or Braun and Clark 2006 paper and then apply the steps and something will emerge from there. And that's a myth. And I hope to show you that it is a myth, and in fact you should avoid it, and rather use leverage points about your theoretical framework, your research questions, etc., to guide the analysis. This is not to say that the analysis is completely closed, but you should have some sense of a guide, some coordinates to help you along. The third point I'm going to make is that you should present your data in a way that demonstrates that you actually have done an analysis. And I'll speak to that point a bit later. So thematic analysis is one of the many ways to analyze qualitative data. It's certainly one of the more popular ways to analyze qualitative data, particularly for novice researchers. Now, of course, there are many, many ways to analyze qualitative data. That includes narrative analysis, phenomenological analysis, discourse analysis, conversation analysis, and so forth. Now, of course, it takes its place alongside a long history of methodological movements in qualitative research. We've had a discursive turn, we've had a narrative turn, we're now engaging in a decolonial turn, we are thinking through indigenous and indigeneity in terms of methodology. So thematic analysis is an analysis method that takes its place alongside many of these movements. Now, of course, there's a long history to thematic analysis. Many people, even outside of the humanities, let alone psychology, have used the term in various ways. But I think it was really advanced by Braun and Clark in the 2006 article focusing on focusing on thematic analysis in psychology. That article is really useful and really was one of the works that catapulted thematic analysis certainly into our view. Interestingly, I looked this morning and that article has received over 100,000 citations. It's incredible. And of course, they've continued, Braun and Clark, to push the thinking around thematic analysis. And what they were really doing is they were quite frustrated that people were doing various levels of thematic analysis, but they weren't really calling it anything. So they aimed to consolidate and claim the idea under one methodological movement. They were also interested in developing a common vocabulary that all of us could use and compare and engage with each other on common terms. But the really interesting thing about thematic analysis is that it's mostly a method. There's very little or no prescriptions on theory and paradigms. Now, I say that in relation to some other forms of analysis, like discourse analysis or perhaps narrative analysis, where there is a very clear link between an overarching paradigm and theoretical orientation, whereas thematic analysis is more flexible and kind of can travel well between different theoretical and paradigmatic worlds. But here's a working definition just to get us going, and that is that thematic analysis is a method for identifying, analyzing, and reporting patterns or themes within data. It minimally organizes and describes your data set in rich detail. And that's a starting point, and we can quibble about definitions, which we should in the academy, but I think this is a useful starting point, especially for those who are engaging with thematic analysis for the first time. What's really important about the thematic analysis is that it's pattern-based. So it looks for patterns among a number of data sources to develop what are called themes, and I'll get to that in a few slides' time. So unlike some methodologies and analytic methods that focus on either a single case or group of cases, here we're trying to understand patterns and how they emerge across data. But of course, it's also very similar to other analysis methodologies or analysis methods, and very similar to qualitative research in general. So I thought I'd take a step back and just point those out. So of course, thematic analysts or people engaging in thematic analysis would pay specific attention to context. So unlike quantitative methods or unlike some very prescriptive methods that tends to want to reduce the complexity of the world, thematic analysis really appreciates the attention to context. It also really embraces naturalistic inquiry. So by this, I mean, we're not interfering with the data too much. We are not using experiments. We're not trying to manipulate or control anything, but we are engaging with data as it emerges from a particular context. We are very much interested in rich and thick description. So in that sense, we're not just interested in jumping straight into the results, for example, but interested in also providing some context in terms of a description of what's happening in the data and in terms of what's happening in the study itself. It's very open to data-driven analysis. Now, this is very important. Now, many of you would have come across the terms called inductive and deductive reasoning. If we were in a workshop, I'd pause now and ask I would have asked you what those mean, but I'll just go ahead and talk to you about inductive and deductive reasoning. I'll also reintroduce a new, well, no, that doesn't make sense. I'll introduce a slightly new concept called abductive reasoning, which I like in terms of how we think about the difference between inductive and deductive. But in a nutshell, inductive reasoning really allows the data to be built from the ground up, and our conclusions are built from the data. Deductive reasoning, we go in with very clear ideas about what we expect to find, what we want to find, and we operate like that. Abductive reasoning, which comes more or less from a pragmatic paradigm, suggests that we do both often in analysis. And I like the way that is conceptualized, that often we allow the data to speak to us and we are open to new ideas, but at the same time, we also have very clear ideas about what we are looking for. And it's this kind of cyclical reasoning that helps us to develop our analysis. Of course, thematic analysis is suited to questions of why and how. It also, of course, embraces the subjective, reflexivity, and intersubjective. It's interested in complexity and power on some level, although not as much as your discourse analysis type work would be. Of course, it doesn't attempt to provide a single answer to anything and really embraces complexity. It can also embrace people's experiences of the psychological and social world, but also can be critical of those experiences. And of course, is also interested in meaning and not necessarily in numbers. One particular aspect of thematic analysis that I like is that I've used it quite often in applied work to understand unanticipated consequences in terms of, for example, evaluation designs. So thematic analysis really does fit in with this broader movement of qualitative methods. There are a number of strengths, though, of thematic analysis compared to other analyses. The first is that it's less tied to a particular theory and paradigm. It is, in fact, a method, and Braun and Clark have mentioned this continuously. Now, again, we can debate the difference between a method and how theoretical or somewhat atheoretical it is, but nonetheless, it doesn't necessarily need to be tied to a particular theory or paradigm. Thematic analysis is also very flexible. You can move in and out, you can move between patterns and codes, you can move between induction and abduction, induction and deduction, You can move between subjectivity and objectivity and so forth. So it does allow for a lot of flexibility, and it's not prescriptive. It's also relatively easy to understand, and it's suited to novice and early career researchers. Of course, it's easy to explain. I think it's easy to explain. I hope it's easy to explain, as I hope to do in this webinar. The weakness is that it does tend to sometimes have an atheoretical feel. It also, for some people, has a limited interpretive power if it's poorly framed. There's also a lack of interpretive guidance, and I think this is deliberate by current thematic analysis authors, in the sense that it's not prescriptive, but it does allow flexibility. But you also, if you're looking for extreme guidance, you're not going to get it in terms of how to actually do a thematic analysis. A weakness is that it focuses on patterns, as I said earlier, which means that individual differences, contradictions, and complexities are lost. It also ignores language power and issues around social constructions, which other methods might be better suited to. So the first point I wanted to make earlier is that analysis starts before analysis. Now, whenever you're doing a qualitative analysis as a student, you really need to be reading deliberately. You need to be reading with structure, and you need to be reading critically. Okay, so the starting point for any work is not in the field, it's not with the data, but its starting point is with you reading and thinking. And as a student working with your supervisor, to identify a clear problem or a gap or a justification for the research. Sometimes we call this the research problematic. Okay. Once you are relatively clear about this problem or this gap or the justification, you need to think through your research questions, or in some instances, your aim and objective, and design a method. Linked with that, of course, all the stuff that happens before the analysis has to include thought around how you sample and how you do your sampling and your actual sample. Now, I'm just going to digress here a little bit and make a point that purposeful sampling, sometimes called purposive sampling, is really, really underdeveloped in our South African context. There's such a lot of information about doing really good, well thought through sampling methods. In fact, the last time I looked in one of the textbooks, there was over 34 different types of purposeful sampling. Yet so often we see manuscripts or theses written where it says, oh, I just selected conveniently. I just went to a mall and selected people, or I asked my friends, and there's really no need to do that. In my view, yes, purposeful convenience sampling is one type of sampling, but there are many others that are embedded in a more rigorous way of thinking than just finding people, okay? But that's a digression. Now, of course, you would have designed your instrument, you'd have thought through your interview guide, you would have collected your data, and more often than not, if you are collecting primary data, you would have recorded your interview. Of course, then you would have stored it, etc. Okay. Now, each of these require a special set of skill. In the courses that I teach, I actually spend several lectures talking about sampling, several lectures about even recording, several lectures, yet even skills around storing your data. These are all important, so they require a special set of skills. Now, once all of that's in place, you have a clear sense of what you're doing, you have a research question. Of course, your research question can change and evolve as you proceed, and in some ways that's expected. But before the analysis starts, you need to have all of those in place. But there are often two common problems before we get into the analysis, all right? And that is that people go in with one or both of these. The one is to prove something. I'm going out to prove something, so I'm not engaging with anything other than what I'm out to prove. Okay, I'm not going to interrogate the data. I'm not allowing myself to be distracted or perhaps be influenced by stuff coming out of the data. I'm looking for what I'm looking for. Okay, and often that leads to quite a deductive and reductive kind of simplistic approach to analysis. The second problem is that people sometimes allow the data to speak for itself. And this is overly inductive, leading to chasing tails. And I tell you now, if you're going to allow the data to speak to you, you're going to be in your research project for a hell of a long time. Okay, so you want to be thinking through an approach, an abductive approach that straddles the two, deduction and induction. Okay. Like I said earlier, researchers should also be relatively clear about why they're doing thematic analysis and should be open to new insights at the same time. Now, before you start the analysis, one overlooked aspect of thematic analysis and qualitative analysis more broadly is that people often do not transcribe their data, especially audio data, and in some instances, audio and video or visual data. So often, and I think it's just such a waste, when people present the data or submit for publications, you find that they say, oh, I just transcribe verbatim. Now, you know, I guess transcribing verbatim for me is like just ignoring the complexity of the data. So in other words, people just write down what people said. Whereas there are transcription conventions that can help you along to help you not only to capture the nuances of your interview, for example, but also to start allowing you to do the analysis. So there are many different types of transcription conventions. I've mentioned two, orthographic transcription and Jeffersonian or Jefferson transcription. Orthographic you can find from Braun and Clark 2013, their book on qualitative research methods. Jefferson, just Google it and you'll find the transcription conventions. Now, properly transcribing audio and visual data brings it to life for the reader by foregrounding nuances, verbal and non-verbal cues, utterances, words like and and tailing and so forth. It also helps you to familiarize yourself with the data if you do it yourself. Now, sometimes students freak out because doing transcriptions properly involves quite a lot of time and resources. But I suggest you do it because it does help you to begin your analysis. As you are transcribing, you start to get familiar with your data and you start to do analysis, even sometimes when you don't realize you're doing it. Okay. But of course, it's very important to not overcook it. All right. You're looking for a good representation of an interview, but you're not necessarily looking for a carbon copy. So here's examples of modified transcription conventions. So if you, and I'll give you a clearer example in a minute. If you are using square brackets, this means it's the start and the end of overlapping speech. You can use arrows to identify pitch movements, how people's voices get raised or lowered. You can use underscore or underlining to indicate emphasis. You can use a number in brackets to demonstrate the length of time of a pause. A pause in speech is a really important signal of something that may or may not be going on. If you have additional comments from as a transcriber, you can put it in sort of double brackets and so forth. Now, as a suggestion, please just have a look for these transcription conventions, and when you find them, you can apply them. So you don't have to apply them as rigorously as some people sometimes suggest, but it's important to have them and to be able to communicate how you use your transcription conventions in preparing your data for analysis. So I just wanted to give you an example of this. So here's an example of an interview. It is sourced from YouTube, but it aired on television, and it's a part of a study that I've been doing on how activists, environmental activists, are undermined in everyday circumstances. So I'm going to play the clip. It's a video I hope you can see and hear it. Then what I'm going to do is show you an example of a small part of the interview that is transcribed verbatim. That's just transcribed as people said stuff. Then I'm going to show you how you can do it using transcription conventions, and hopefully show you how the interview comes alive for the reader in the transcription when you're using the transcription convention. So here goes.
We can hear that. Okay.
And welcome back to the big debate. We're discussing water and sanitation. Now, earlier this year, a group of activists hit the headlines in Cape Town when they were seen dumping containers of human feces in public places around the city. One of the so-called poo protesters is Andy Lili. He's here with us today. Poo protests. Now, come on. This is not how you change government policy. Oh, you really think this is going to work?
Obviously, I know you might have that kind of perception, but where we live, we wanted to expose how our people, African people and colored community in Cape Town are subjected to. And as individuals, as activists, we cannot tolerate to walk right across the feces in our streets in Khayelitsha and across Cape Town. We are saying that is totally unaccepted, and we are saying that is unhygienic. If it is unhygienic for people who live in Cape Town, if it is also unhygienic for people in airport, it is also unhygienic for us as people who live in informal settlements.
One wrong, though. Two wrongs don't make a right.
Okay, I'm going to pause it there. I hope you heard the interview. Did you? Can someone give me a thumbs up or a yes?
Yes, Prof.
You did. Okay, great. So there's a lot going on there. It looks like a simple interview, right? And I played you probably 25 seconds of a clip, but there's a heck of a lot going on in there. So let's just look at, if you transcribe verbatim, right? This is what it would look like. The interviewer says, one of the poo protesters is with us here today, Andile Lily. Poo protests. Now, come on. This is not how you change government policy. Do you really think that this is going to work? Andile Lily says, obviously, I know you might have that kind of perception. Where we live, we wanted to expose how the African people and colored community in Cape Town are subjected to. And as individuals and activists, we cannot tolerate to walk right across feces in our street in Cape Town. We're saying that that is totally unacceptable. Now, if you look at that, you don't get a sense of the nuances, the small details of the interaction of the interview, right? It's quite a flat. And while it might seem fine, you're actually losing a lot of information. So here's an example of an orthographic, of this very same clip, orthographic transcription, using, I guess, a light version of transcription conventions. It's exactly the same thing. The first thing I want to show you is that I've now labeled the extract so that I could refer back. So I've labeled the numbers on the left-hand side there. All right, numbers line 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through to 8. And then if you look at the interview, you'll see one of the poo protesters here. And here there's emphasis. Today, Andile Lili, poo protest. Now, come on. And we see in a very incredulous tone. This is not how you change government policy. Are you really? And there's an important pause there, right? Do you really think that this is going to work? Andile Lili says, obviously, and there's another pause. I know, another pause. You might have that kind of perception. And remember, he was fidgeting with his sleeve, which actually demonstrates quite a lot in terms of non-verbal behavior. Where we live, we wanted to expose our African people and colored community in Cape Town are subject to. And you see him pausing here again, and he's struggling to find his words. As individuals and activists, we cannot tolerate to walk through. Importantly, he shows a walking action across the feces in our street in Cape Town. We are saying that another pause, that is totally unacceptable. Now this, it might look a little clumsy, but it's actually revealing much more about the reality of the interview than what a verbatim, a straight, simple transcription would reveal. It's showing the emphasis, it's showing the pauses, it's showing elements of perhaps uncomfortableness, it's showing the word use. So, for example, individuals and activists. Later on in the analysis, that underlined phrase there, individuals and activists, would become very important because Andile Lilly was trying very hard to show that he is an independent activist, despite the fact that the interviewer was always pointing him back to ANC Youth League politics and the fact that he is a suspended member of a party, a political party. He was saying, no, he's speaking as an individual. So words like individuals and activists really become important. Poo protesters, also the use of the word poo protesters with emphasis, and in some cases so-called poo protesters, gives us a sense of how of really rich data about how the interviewer is perhaps trying to undermine the speaker, Andile Lilly. So the second point I wanted to make very quickly is that thematic analysis is not a step-by-step process. Okay, so often, in addition to chasing your tail, we have responses like this: I've applied thematic analysis using the 6 steps and I don't know what to do and I haven't found anything. I am lost. The number of times I've heard this in academia is frightening. Now, sadly, we teach research methods, and those who've interacted with me know why I get so upset when we teach research methods in such a step-by-step fashion. And we teach research methods as if it's a recipe book or a recipe, as if we're cooking something from a recipe book. And this has quite negative consequences later on. For example, when you are doing postgraduate studies, when people like me saying, please, please, please use it as a guide. Don't use it as set in stone, as concrete. Okay. Now, Braun and Clark have certainly outlined steps, but these are guidelines, and Braun and Clark go to great lengths to tell you that these are guidelines, okay, on how to approach the analysis. Don't think that miraculously you're going to use them, or you're going to do a computer analysis of your data, a software analysis, and you are going to miraculously come up with your findings. There's very little space for miracles in research and qualitative research. So really, a lot of it revolves around going back to your leverage points, your research question, your theoretical orientation, and really use your thinking, use your knowledge, use what you've read to guide you in the analysis. Okay. And yeah, I've called them leverage points, but really do think through your research problematic, but also please also ask for guidance from your supervisor when you're starting to get lost. Okay. We definitely want to avoid this picture. So we have collected our data, we have stored our data, we have transcribed our data, we've hopefully used a form of transcription convention to bring our data alive and allow us to give more nuanced interpretation to our data. Now we need to start with the analysis. So the first point in a thematic analysis is to develop codes. Now, what are codes? A code, according to Braun and Clark, is a word or a brief phrase that captures the essence of why you think a particular piece of data may be useful. All right, so you could use a number of methods. Some people use computer software. I'm still old-fashioned. I print out my transcriptions. I use colored markers. I use Post-its. I use, you name it, cookies, and I do a very physical kind of analysis. Often I write things out, I map things out on massive pieces of paper, and my office and home office is usually a disaster when I'm doing those kinds of analyses because it's messy and it's all over the place. And you'll see notes all over, all right? But you do whatever you need to do to be able to develop these initial codes, okay? In order to do so, you need to have your research question in the back of your mind, but you also need to read your transcript very carefully and familiarize yourself with the data. Look for noticeables, as what Braun and Clark sometimes refer to as little bits and bobs of information that might help answer your research questions. Label the data in however manner you choose. And at this point, especially early on, try to be as inclusive as possible. Okay, but don't go off on a tangent. Try to be as inclusive as possible. And remember that codes can be one of two things, and this comes back to my earlier musings around induction and deduction, and hopefully take an abductive approach somewhere in between. Codes can be researcher generated. In other words, you could look for codes, hidden meanings perhaps that are not that obvious, and this is what we call latent codes. Codes can also be data generated, that they are quite obvious, right? And we call these semantic codes. So don't get bogged down again by the details of what to call a code. Be as inclusive as possible, but remember, codes can come from the data, but importantly that they can be generated by the researcher, okay, in looking for deeper meaning, stuff that's going on behind the scenes. I often use the analogy of looking at a river. Sometimes if you look at a river, what you see on the top is the water flowing. It looks very beautiful, usually, unless it's highly polluted. But what you're also interested in is the stuff that's happening under the river, the flow of the water, the rocks under the water, the depth of the water, the fish, the insects, the plants, and so forth. That all influence how the surface of a river looks. So that's just one analogy to think about the difference perhaps between a latent code and a semantic code. All right. Now, importantly, your codes come together in terms of putting together a theme. Now, people often get confused between a code and a theme. Your code is essentially, if you think of a brick house, your codes, and this is Braun and Clark's example. If you think of a brick house, your codes are your individual bricks in a wall, okay? They're your individual bricks in a wall, right? So you could have lots and lots and lots and lots of codes, okay? But the wall itself, right, brings those bricks together under a theme. So a theme is a central organizing concept that tells us something meaningful about the data in relation to the research question. The same for a roof. If you can just imagine a roof that's made up of a lot of tiles. Each individual tile can be a code, all right? But when they're put together, they become a roof, which of course is a theme, all right? So very simplistically, that's the way Braun and Clark have in the past explained it. Now, there are many different ways of explaining it, but I hope you get the point that on a small level, a code would be an individual brick. So if you look at the image here, you'd see individual bricks, but they can also, all the different bricks come together in terms of a theme. So I wanted to just share a real-world example of an analysis. It's a current project that we're involved with. I'll shoot very quickly through it because I'm actually out of time. But it's really looking at understanding representations of youth climate activism. Vanessa Nakate, who's on the bottom left picture to the left, is an African youth climate activist. She's quite prominent, and she traveled to Davos in Switzerland in the early part of 2020, and she joined other famous activists like Greta Thunberg. And in the media reporting afterwards, the top left picture was published without Vanessa. So the bottom left picture is the actual picture. The media outlet, Associated Press, cropped her out. So this was devastating, and she claimed that it was racism, and in my view it was. But the after effects were tremendous. It was really, really interesting to see. Vanessa Nakate was obviously quite upset by this. And she went to Twitter and she released a very emotional video explaining how it was racist and how hurtful it was, and how African climate activists tend to be ignored. So this project really looks at how African youth climate activists are represented in the media, as well as in general public discourse. She also courted some other controversy by writing a handwritten note on your right to the President-elect, Joe Biden, and Vice President-elect of the United States of America, Kamala Harris, asking them to please take climate change more seriously. Now, what's really interesting here is that Vanessa was vilified for this, despite what I think was a horrible act against her by being removed from a photo. When she came home back to Uganda, all the interviews, media interviews, the journalists actually vilified her for claiming racism. They argued that it wasn't racist. They argued that she has no place to be with more famous white and Western activists, that she is, I guess, punching above her station. And she was vilified on a number of levels. So the question that we were asking, and I've collaborated with a colleague, Daniela Raffaelli, on this, we really were looking at how are African climate youth activists subtly undermined, and how do they resist that subtle undermining. Now, there were a number of things happening, but the point I want to make here is that we developed codes, and in one of the papers we used a conversation analysis, Daniela did. One of the papers we wrote, I used discourse analysis, and the work I'm doing currently now tries to bring together using a thematic analysis, how the different kinds of themes come together to answer the research questions. So we developed step by step a number of codes, and then bringing it into themes, and then the two themes that we worked with eventually was intersectional oppression and in situ agency. So the last point I want to make very quickly is that when you are presenting your findings, it's a common mistake to let the data speak for itself. Don't do that, all right? So some people do this. They'll say, it is evident from the following extract that Professor Barnes said, don't let the data speak for itself. Now, don't do that. Show that you've done an analysis when you are writing about, when you're using a thematic analysis. Another common mistake is to use what I call floating extracts, where the reader is required to do their own analysis. So not only is this a lazy analysis, but there is a danger that the reader may draw conclusions different to yours. Okay. My preference would be to introduce the extracts and then also actually show an analysis when you are presenting, to show that you're doing. Now, recently I submitted a paper, and this is a good example from a reviewer who accused me of doing exactly what I've said you shouldn't do. And it says here, the description of the methodology I used thematic analysis is poor. It's mentioned that blah, 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 blah. But how did these data sources, how were they used? Did I apply any specific method? How are the data sources selected, etc.? So in some ways, I didn't describe and I didn't actually show that I did an analysis. I did exactly what I'm asking you not to do. So I thought I'd just include that to show you that even professors are vulnerable to these mistakes. So in conclusion, thematic analysis can be a meaningful and enjoyable and analytic method. I've given you hopefully 3 ideas to improve your experience of it. And that is to get your ducks in a row before your analysis. Don't view the analysis as a recipe book. Use your leverage points and show that you've done an analysis. I'm going to stop there, and I wish you everything of your best with your analysis if you are using thematic analysis. Thank you. Hopefully there's a little bit of time for questions.
Pakiza, are you there?
I am, yeah. I'm checking whether the chat has any questions, but thank you so much, Prof. This was really very insightful. Prof, while we're waiting for some other questions from our audience, something I often see is that students would turn their research aims or their research questions. So they'll have an interview and they'll turn their research questions into themes. Do you have any advice for us on how to not do that?
Yeah, well, it depends if, you know, if they are well thought through themes. But I guess I would answer that in the sense that we should avoid being lazy when we're doing our analysis. We should really try our best to analyze the data, try our best to look at what's going on the surface, but also what's going on at a slightly deeper level. So, you know, that might or may not, I mean, that might overlap significantly with your research questions. But I think it's important to ask the deeper questions. So in many of the Braun and Clark, for example, and other thematic analysts' writings, they would push people to answer a question about, is this really a theme? Is this really a theme, or are you just trying to impose something quite descriptive on it? Does it bring together different parts into a coherent whole? And that's the way I would answer that. So not necessarily whether you should or shouldn't do it, but to what degree has the person actually engaged in an analysis and drawn it all together, drawn the different codes and found a coherent pattern.
Thanks, Prof. Then we have Doreen asking, what is the maximum quotes that you can use per theme, if any?
Yeah, so, you know, there aren't any. I've come across wonderful papers with just 2 quotations, but they are analyzed and presented in a thorough and rigorous way and are brought back to the research question and the theoretical framework. So there aren't any maximum minimum prescriptions. I've seen wonderful thematic analysis done on very few, but also some that have been done on quite a lot. So again, you know, avoid thinking about it like that, rather focus on doing a quality analysis.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Zondi, do you maybe want to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, ma'am. So I'm about to do data collection. I'd like to, from 2 different sites, like a rural site and an urban site. So I just want to know, when I am doing my data collection and data analysis, do I have to collect everything and then start doing a data analysis, or I can just collect it from the rural area, do the analysis, and then from the urban area, and then do the analysis and compare the 2?
So my answer to that really is, it comes back to my point I was trying to make, and that's analysis starts before analysis, if that makes any sense. So you shouldn't stop yourself from thinking about what even as you're interviewing, even when you've finished interviewing and you have a notebook, I hope you have a notebook, and you're writing down your notes and your observations, even when you wake up at night and have a thought, write it down. Your analysis doesn't need to be this fixed, okay, today I'm going to start my analysis. That to me is not very helpful, because you start thinking about your analysis and your findings from day one, actually. So I wouldn't necessarily see this as a, you know, today I'm going to finish data collection and then I'm going to start. Even as you are interviewing, you should be thinking about questions that you could perhaps ask at a later stage, or perhaps questions you could ask of other participants. So it's very iterative, and I don't think it's useful to have a very set point. Okay.
All right, thank you so much.
That said, if it's part of your if it's really part of your design, for example, you're doing a very clear sequential kind of design where you want to take stock, for example, of the I think you said the rural areas, and then allow yourself some time to think through some of the questions that you're going to ask in the urban areas, then by all means do. Okay, but there are no right and wrong. It just depends on what you aim to do. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Prof. That was very insightful. We have Samantha then asking, how do you do transcriptions conventions when you are doing a telephonic interview?
Okay, so you transcribe you would hopefully record your interview with the participants' permission, right? Then you'd listen to that interview, that recorded interview, and that's when you can use transcription conventions, okay? And that's when typically you apply it. So you don't do it in the moment, definitely not. Now, there are a number of ways in which there's also software that can help you to transcribe automatically. There's a lot of different ways. The machines, I mean, when I was training 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, in qualitative methods, we all had recorders, and we had a transcription machine that you'd use a pedal, and it'll play back your cassette. And when you lift your pedal, it'll go back. So there's a number of ways in which you can do it, some more complicated than others. But the actual transcription conventions you apply when you are transcribing from the audio or the visual onto, in a different format. I hope I've answered that.
Okay, well, one maybe last question from Janine. So what is the core difference between thematic analysis and content analysis?
I was waiting for that question. So some people refer to a thematic content analysis. There's a definite there's a movement, obviously, called content analysis, but it depends on a number of things. The one thing is the approach in which you are going to analyze your data, with content analysis also including perhaps counting the frequency of occurrences of a particular thing linked with a focus on themes. Okay, so in some of the studies that I've conducted, we've needed to demonstrate that participants said a particular thing X number of times. And this was the most frequently reported answer, even qualitatively, not quantitative, qualitatively. And we've used a version of thematic content analysis in that respect.
That looks like all questions for now. Just also a comment for you, Prof, from Mashudu, that it was a very interesting presentation that was highly appreciated from all of us.
Good.
Fatima, your hand is up.
So going to your presentation, you were speaking about the young female activist from Uganda being gaslighted and her experience being excluded. So obviously when you're a researcher, you're choosing a topic that's really close to your heart. So if you chose to do her experiences of being excluded and not acknowledged as an activist, how do you stop yourself from how do you analyze the data and stop yourself from seeing something that might not be there? I don't know if I'm clear in my question.
Yeah, I think so. I think your question is speaking to the continuum of subjectivity, objectivity question, if I'm not mistaken, Fatima. But so within a qualitative tradition, more generally, it is possible to move along that continuum. I particularly like a term called intersubjective, that you go in with your passions, you go in on some levels trying to explore and prove something, but at the same time which can be viewed as subjective, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you're also going in with some objective view of trying to understand the patterns that are going on genuinely. Otherwise it becomes an opinion piece, right? Or vice versa. If it's overly objective, it becomes just a piece where you are not exploring the rich nuances and complexities. So I would like to, I personally adopt a view of what could be called intersubjective, where you are flowing between different things. Sometimes you are getting ahead of yourself, but you are also trying to to maintain an objective kind of view, right? Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much for that. Pakiza, there's one more question. Prof, we have a question. In terms of individual interviews applying Jeffersonian systems, how do you account for the various reactions to the researcher? Would you include these relational component in the discourse or interview process?
So that's a very important question. So remember that interview clip I sent you, I portrayed. Now there are so many different ways to analyze that, okay? So you could analyze it interactionally. So for example, conversation analysis would look at the interactions and the turn taking and the issues that are happening in that sense. You could also analyze it in terms of power. You could analyze it in terms of how language is used, which is what a discourse analysis would lean towards. But you could also analyze it thematically in how themes are starting to come out in the data. Now, an important point which Gerrit's question has reminded me about is that you shouldn't. So some people have a very strong. They use Jeffersonian or Jefferson transcription conventions in a very, very rigorous manner, and that's not necessarily required all the time it's not necessarily required in thematic analysis. That's why I called it a modified or a Jefferson light that you could use. So it's your choice in terms of the detail you want to transcribe. If your analysis is asking of you to look at how interaction happens in interviews, then it's essential to have applied a very, very rigorous transcription convention, including but not limited to Jefferson. All right. If you are doing a thematic analysis, you are well within your rights to use a modified version of any of the transcription conventions. So I just gave you two. I hope I've answered that and get it. So the short answer depends on what your analysis. It depends on what your analysis is asking of you.
Thanks, Prof, for answering that. And sorry, thanks, Fatima, for covering that one for me. I was talking with myself muted. But it does look like it's 1 o'clock on my side. So thank you very much for the hour, Prof. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Some really nice questions coming through in the chat. Yes, remember to review and evaluate the webinar, and then see you next week for our next webinar.
And just one thing, if you're a student, please consult your supervisor, okay? Continuously in your analysis. All right, thank you very much for the invitation.
The link for the presentation is in the chat box. If you could click on the link, it would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, bye.